It's exciting to talk to Swarthmore students. So I went to Bryn Mawr, graduated in 2007.
And I was Swarthmore class of 08.
So we met in Upper Tarble and spent a bunch of time kind of me hanging around Swarthmore while Jeff was finishing up. So I think we'll start with kind of just how we got involved, to some kind of like narrative, and then some maybe like lessons learned and that kind of thing, and then turn it over to more informal kind of back and forth. So I had, as a kid and a teenager, I had this interest in kind of what I could do to make the world a more fair place. I was really like worried about kind of poverty. It seemed really unfair that I and my family had more than we needed. Not to an extreme degree, but like kind of upper middle class American folks with college educations just had more than we needed when a lot of people didn't have basic needs met. That seemed really messed up to me, that like people weren't more alarmed about that, or like that wasn't seen as like a problem we should be doing something about in any significant way. So donation was kind of the way that I latched onto as a teenager as a way that I could kind of make the world fairer and better. And so I tried to spend as little money as I could so that I would be able to donate more, and was still kind of in that mindset in college when I met Jeff at a folk dance event that he was organizing. And so at that point, I was really into like frugality. Jeff was too, but more because that's just like a personal habit or inclination or something, rather than because of donation. So at first, I just assumed that like I was never gonna find anyone else who kind of had a similar view on donation, especially, or on like living really frugally, and that I was gonna kind of be the extremist in any relationship I was in. And at first that was like kind of true or something. Like Jeff was like a little sketched out by the degree to which I wanted to prioritize that. And so we were just figuring like, okay, well, we'll have separate finances or something.
Yeah. The way I think Julia sort of initially described this to me is something like, so I should let you know that like I have some kind of weird views. Well, that's okay. Like I like you a lot. Like, what are your weird views? Well, so I think like other people matter a lot. Well, of course. No, I mean, I think other people matter like a lot, and it's kind of wrong for me to keep stuff for myself. So like when I earn money, I just want to give all of it away. Are you okay with that? Like, well, I don't want to do that with my money, but I guess you can do that with your money.
So, at first we were students and it wasn't too big a deal. And then the first like year or so that I was out of college, we had various jobs. We worked at a summer camp where like, housing was included, so we didn't have to figure out rent. Then we got engaged pretty fast. Basically, after about 6 months, I proposed to Jeff, which worked out remarkably well, given how like little I knew at the time or something. So when Jeff finished college, I had like worked as a cook for a while nearby, and then we worked at a summer camp, and then we rented a room from his parents. So that was when we started needing to kind of like make real financial decisions for the first time. And it was also, so this was around 2008, and it was also when Jeff started to like find clues on the internet that there were other people out there who were thinking about these things. So he told me like, there's this guy, Peter Singer, like you should go read his stuff because he's writing about the same thing. And I think you also found Brian Tomasic, who went to Swarthmore at the same year as...
Brian Tomasic was SWAT 09.
09, okay. So he was one of these like early kind of like, well, early being like I don't know, 12 years ago, utilitarian writers in like a weird corner of the internet. And so we had both kind of like met him a bit at SWAT. You had, spent more time with him than I had. But so that was kind of another thread that we were like starting to pick up on, that there were these other kind of bits out there. And then GiveWell was another kind of thread that I think Jeff found first. And so we started thinking about kind of what other ideas were out there beyond just like the stuff that I had figured out. I think I guess it was after I paid off my college debt, something like that. We kind of like the first real donation that we made kind of like after I graduated, at least. I kind of did like one evening of research online. And I was like, well, I found this charity that seems like it has a good reputation. I can't find like complaints about them. And they're doing like international development work, which seems like a good area. And so we both thought like, well, that's about as good as it's going to get in terms of like how to find a charity. So that was like the state of our research at that point. And then we started like getting these sort of other threads of like, oh, there's GiveWell out there doing like a serious job at this research question, or like, people are like spending more than one evening on it.
I do want to go a little bit back. So Julia is giving stuff that's sort of relevant to her, but there's a bit that's very relevant to me, which is that, so I started off sort of thinking that like, yeah, I mean, I guess sort of other people matter. I guess charity is good, but like, what does this have to do with me? Like, I don't really feel any sort of obligation to give, or even especially feel pulled to it. And then sort of after talking with Julia a lot over sort of around the sort of first year I knew her, I sort of came around to like, no, actually this thing where like we have a lot of money. I mean, we didn't have like, at that stage, like, we didn't have as much money as we do now. We had less money than, say, the median American, but still, like, compared to like people around the world, we were in a very good position.
And we expected to be able to get good jobs and to have more money in the future.
Right. And anyway, so I came around to this idea that it just like wasn't fair for me to take whatever it was that I earned and just like spend it on whatever sort of mattered to like me and my family. And came around to not exactly the same view as Julia, but a much more similar view than I had started. Like I moved much more toward Julia's position in terms of thinking that like, yes, I should be trying to use a substantial portion of my time or money to like do good things. And then we started thinking about sort of like the effectiveness aspect. Like we started off with just sort of like an altruism and sacrifice perspective. Like, okay, well, if I have this much money, I should like divide it, and I should spend some of it on me and like give away some other portion, but not really thinking about like, okay, or not thinking a lot about like, okay, well, what are the different things we could put money into, and like, how do they differ? And so as Julia was saying, we like started learning about like GiveWell and other places that were thinking about this a lot.
And another piece that Jeff kind of introduced to me at this point, which I hadn't thought of before, was, well, you don't just have this like fixed amount of money and then you try to be really frugal with it. Like you could also try to earn more money. And
which like sounds really simple, but like it also is very different than what either of us grew up with. Like we grew up in families that like didn't emphasize you should earn as much money as possible. Like I grew up going to Quaker meeting, and like the idea that you would try to like maximize your income like for charitable purposes was just like, I don't know, alien.
Yeah, so I think we both grew up in kind of like liberal hippie-ish kind of environments that really emphasize like finding your personal calling and like doing something that would like pay your bills, but like not trying to like really pursue a high salary. And that it felt really weird to me, that idea at first, because I felt like, oh, that's something greedy people do, or like that's not something that I would do. And so it really like, I found it like pretty distressing to think about at first. And it wasn't super relevant for me because I just majored in sociology, which, you know, nobody's like banging down the door to give high dollar jobs to a sociology major with no work experience. But so Jeff was a linguistics and computer science double major. And at the time we met, you know, he was kind of like undecided about what of those he might go into. Turns out it's much easier to find jobs in computer science than in linguistics. So
though I had already decided that before sort of getting into like proto-EA ideas. I was considering going to linguistics grad school, and then like had already decided to look for like some sort of programming job. Yeah.
So at the point that we sort of started looking for real jobs, basically, Jeff pretty quickly got some different computer science jobs. You can maybe say more about that later. I kind of was like a little harder to employ, and found a temp job at Oxfam, which was the charity that I had found in my one evening of research. which was great. So I like loved working there. And I hoped that I could be really useful at Oxfam, and I kind of just couldn't. Like I was doing sort of administrative work and didn't have, I like would have loved to work in international development. I just like, I didn't have any background in it. I didn't have skills. And so after a couple of years of that, I went to grad school to become a social worker, which is one of the things that I had kind of considered in the first place. And
well, there's like a missing seg. So like you're saying like, well, I noticed I didn't have international development skills. So I decided to like go to get a degree in social work. But like,
why don't you just say the thing you think
sure.
you're missing?
So right. So you weren't doing this as a way to, oh dear, my computer's falling asleep. Sorry, my computer fell asleep. I'm going to turn on something to make it not fall asleep. Okay. So you were saying that you realized that you didn't have sort of the skills that would be useful to work at Oxfam in international development. But then when you went to school in social work, that was, my memory from the time is you were trying to figure out what is the job I could do that I would enjoy and would make me the most money out of the jobs that I could do, right?
I was going to say that part a little later.
Okay.
But, so I went to grad school for social work. I think the like interpersonal kind of like face-to-face work really appealed to me. That was something I was pretty good at. And we had, by this time we were getting more in touch with like other kind of proto EAs. So like EA, like with that name didn't exist at the time. But sort of the emphasis at that point in the sort of beginnings of the EA community was really on earning to give, which also didn't have a name at the time. But kind of the beginnings of 80,000 hours were getting started, and they were starting to really kind of like, there was a lot more interest in earning to give and like how could we increase funding by all getting these like cool jobs in finance. And so the people we knew were kind of like, that was the vibe at the time of like, how do you get a job in finance, or how do you get some job that will allow you to donate a bunch of money. And so kind of like midway through this 2-year program, I kind of had this crisis of like, well, this pays like a bit better than it did, you know, being an administrative assistant, but it's not a very high paying job. And what if I'm really doing this terribly wrong thing by not optimizing more for earnings? You know, at the time we had switched to giving to GiveWell recommended charities. We kind of knew more about the cost effectiveness, so I could kind of
think we'd switched yet. I don't think we actually made our first donation to a GiveWell recommended charity until after you graduated.
Okay.
But maybe we had like decided to switch.
Yeah, I think we knew more about cost effectiveness at the time. Yeah. And so I could kind of put this dollar amount on like, okay, if I'm earning like 100K less than I could as a doctor or something each year, then that's like 100K divided by the cost of saving a life is however many lives I'm like letting slip by, so that I can have a career I enjoy more or something. And that just seemed really messed up and wrong. But I also couldn't really imagine going into these fields that I was considering, and like couldn't find a field that I felt like would be a good fit for me and let me like earn a bunch more money, and that I thought would be like, that I would be fairly happy in. And like medical school, I thought that I could like probably be happy as a doctor or something. I'm interested in the mental health field. I was studying that in social work school, so I could have done that in some other way. But just like going back and taking the math and science classes that I would have needed to do med school, plus like actual med school and residency, just seemed pretty awful. And I was just like really not excited about it. So I decided to stick with the social work plan, and just felt like really bad about being this sort of really suboptimal EA by the standards of the time, that I like wasn't going to earn that much. So yeah, it was around the time that we kind of got sold on the GiveWell kind of idea. I think I had written a blog post about, so I had started this blog, Giving Gladly, about kind of trying to introduce EA ideas in a less cerebral and more kind of like common sense way. I wanted to be able to explain it in ways that like my parents would understand, or like that you didn't have to be like a super nerd to like get. So I'd been writing these blog posts, and one of them was about kind of like deciding whether to continue donating to Oxfam versus GiveWell, and they like wanted to have a call basically, and they just talked me through their whole methodology, and I was like, yeah, this is better than what the Oxfam people like have in terms of arguments. So we switched to donating to GiveWell recommended charities. We got married during that time, and
yeah, during that period, so I had been working at sort of my first job out of college. After we were working at the summer camp, my first programming job, it was one that, it wasn't the job that sort of paid the best out of the ones that I initially had offers at, but it used both linguistics and computer science, which I was like quite excited about. And so it felt like it was a really good fit for me. It turned out not to be a really good fit for me. I really did not like that job. I really enjoyed the part of linguistics where you like look at a lot of examples and like try to find the patterns. And it turns out that in computational linguistics, that's the bit we make the computer do. Which meant that this job was essentially just like any other programming job, except I did a little bit of work with linguistic data.
And it was more corporate and boring.
Yeah, well, it wasn't just corporate. It was it was government contracts, and there were a lot of rules around government contracts that were, I don't know, quite unpleasant. And so I didn't like a lot of aspects of working there. And so I switched to work at a company, a startup doing ads. And then and at that stage, I still hadn't really gotten like, no, you should be trying to like, if you're going to be taking an earning to give approach, you really should be trying to like maximize your income, or at least like seeing like among the things that I could like plausibly do with the background I have, like, is this where I could make the most money? And I was like quite happy at this ad startup. I probably would have stayed there for a good while longer. It was nice coworkers, but sort of paying attention to EA ideas got me thinking about like, well, hold on. This is like maybe I could make more money like if I switched to Google. Google like famously paid like a lot more money. And I remember Carl Schulman pushing me to do this. And so I interviewed at Google, and they decided to hire me. So I was then, I was at Google for quite a few years, doing just like, as Google became like an increasingly, a company that was doing very well financially, this then let me donate a lot more than I would have otherwise. And again, this is another thing, like it feels like it's a really simple idea. Like if you are a programmer and you are like earning money so you can give it away, why not consider companies based on how much they pay and like pick the ones that pay more? But like coming from a background of like, well, you should have enough money for yourself, but like you don't have to maximize income. Like it wasn't a very natural way of looking at things for me.
I think there are a bunch of things that in retrospect, I'm like, oh my gosh, how did we not see that earlier? But like, I don't know, it just makes me realize, okay, there are probably things right now that we're not seeing or not recognizing that in 4 or 5 years, we'll all think like, oh man, EA was so like unaware of this at the time. Do you want to say about your wave period and then maybe
yeah, I wasn't sure how to get into it.
Yeah.
So I was at Google from like 2012 until 2017, and I left Google to go work at a startup doing mobile money called Wave. So mobile money is this thing that has really taken off, like especially starting in like the late 2000s, where people could use their phones to transfer money to each other, including like not a smartphone, like you could do it with a dumb phone over something very similar to SMS. It had been, so like the first sort of really, really big popular mobile money program was in Kenya, where Safaricom built M-Pesa.
We're 23 minutes into our 30 minutes.
Okay. Sorry. I get very excited about technical things sometimes. But so I was very excited about the idea to like help build something similar in Ethiopia, because it had seemed to have been quite positive in Kenya. And so I thought that this was probably something that would pay me less than at Google, but also where the sort of direct impact of my job might be quite a lot larger. I mean, like what I was doing at Google, I wasn't doing it all for the direct impact, and that like this might be an opportunity to turn sort of my software development skills into something that was directly useful in the world. So I was quite excited about that. I left Google. I worked at Wave for about 5 months before it became clear that this was not going to work. The regulatory environment in Ethiopia was very complex, and we were not doing a good job managing it, and we decided to shut that project down. And I was laid off. And then I spent a while trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I spent about...
Considered running for office for 2 days.
Yeah, not a good fit for me.
Did some other like independent research on like AI.
Yeah, I spent about a month trying to understand why it was that all of my Swarthmore classmates that I knew from CS at Swarthmore thought that superintelligence risk was silly, and then I knew a whole lot of people in EA who thought it was like extremely serious and potentially like a disaster. And these views were very far apart. And I spent a while talking to a bunch of people and interviewing them and writing up notes and trying to understand why they disagreed so much. I would say that project was not actually successful. Like, I didn't really end up understanding why they disagreed so much. I think I didn't really have enough machine learning background to understand why they had such different views. And it also like really taught me that I didn't enjoy that kind of independent research. I just got really, really lonely. So I ended up deciding to go back to Earning to Give. I interviewed at a few companies. Google was still willing to pay me more, so I came back to Google, and I've been here for, I guess, 4 years now.
So 2 other threads. One was we had kind of like always intended to have children, basically. Like that was something that we talked about early on. Then like several years into us being married and just me getting, I don't know, more steeped in EA or something, I really worried that it was a morally wrong decision to make, because it would mean, at the time I was mostly concerned about money. I wasn't really thinking about the time commitment, which now feels like maybe the bigger deal to me. But I was really conscious of how it would mean that we had less money that we could possibly donate, and felt like that might just be like morally unacceptable to me. And I was really unhappy about that, because I really like always planned to have children, wanted to have children. Like Jeff he had started out like a little lukewarm on the question, and by this time he was, he'd been planning for years that we were gonna have kids. And so that was what we both wanted, and it was just a pretty big deal to now kind of like try and cut that plan out of like what I thought was going to happen. I was pretty down about it, and just feeling like our lives weren't going to be like what we had hoped or wanted in this important way. And at some point, Jeff sort of said, like, this is a bad thing. Like, you're kind of being so unhappy about this. And at the time we had separate budgets, because we had really different ideas about how much, what as a proportion to donate.
I think at that time it was 100% of what Julia earned, and 30%
minus some
of
like
what I
work
earned.
Expenses and taxes and stuff.
No, we were doing 100% of what you earned.
Taxes as well?
Yeah.
So because we had these separate budgets, Jeff was like, I'm going to set aside, we've looked at the estimates of like what it costs to raise a child to age 18. I'm going to set aside that money, and you can't donate it. I'm not going to donate it. And we can either spend it to have a child, or we can take a lot of nice vacations or something. Like, we can spend it on something else, but we're not going to give it away. So like it took away the like financial incentive to me to like try and cut costs here. And with that, it just felt clear that like, yeah, what I wanted to do with the money was absolutely raise a child. So we got married when we were like 23.
So in retrospect, I think like there like one particularly weird bit is that we focused so much on the financial aspects of raising a child. Like there's a lot, like, I mean, the time aspect is also very large.
Yep.
And like there was nothing that I could do to like say, I'm going to like
you can't buy out the time.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So
but at that time, I think we also just weren't thinking of our time as that valuable or something, except in that you could use it to earn money.
Anyway.
So we got married when we were 23, which now I'm like, wow, we were babies. And then had our first child at 28. And I don't know. By then, I think it just seemed like I think our budget plan at that point was much more sort of solid in that we had been kind of like doing this. I had been doing, especially me, had been doing a lot of like angsting over every step of like, at one point, just like every purchase. And it quickly became clear that that was like a way to drive yourself crazy really fast. And so we started just having like a set budget of like, this is how much we're spending on housing and stuff. This is how much we're donating. And so we would figure out a percentage. I think
by that time we had switched to donating 50% of our combined income.
So it was, for a while we had this like whole complicated system about like a percentage plus like an amount or like minus an amount or something. And like we eventually just moved towards kind of by iterating. And I do recommend that plan of like try out a budget for a while, whether it's like a semester or a year or whatever. I think we learned a lot by sort of saying, this is what we're going to do for a set time period and see how it works. And then have permission to reconfigure it once we had learned like, oh, well, that was too much or too little, or like this way of calculating it is really annoying or whatever. So we eventually switched to like, we've committed to donate at least 30% each year. Typically it's been more. So the last like, I don't know, 7 years, something like that. It's been 50%.
Yeah, so we're sort of, we took the Giving What We Can pledge, which typically people take at 10%. We have taken it at 30%. So for the rest of our lives, we're saying we're going to give 30% of what we earn. And then each year we try and figure out like what's a budget for spending versus giving. And each year for the past like almost 10 years at this point, we've decided on 50%.
So I think that was part of the logic also of like, well, could we like having one child? Should we have another one? And at that point, I think that we were feeling pretty good about the 50% ratio as like something that let us donate really significantly, but also gave us plenty of money left over, just because computer programmers are paid like freakishly high salaries at some places. So we just feel like really lucky that that is the way things worked out, and it could have easily, been different. But given the amount of money we had coming in, that's kind of where we've been pretty happy. And half of that income is still more than what a typical US family lives on. It's way more than a typical world, household lives on. And our friend Toby Ward, who started Giving What We Can and was kind of, he was like one of the people that was like a grown-up EA that we were like really looking up to at the time and trying to, like, as we were trying to figure all this stuff out, like he had already thought about it a lot. And one thing I remember him saying is like, it's obviously possible. He had taken a pledge that's capped at like £18,000 for him personally, and then his wife is capped at like a higher amount, which it's more now with inflation, but he said it's obviously possible to live on this amount and to raise children on this amount because almost everyone in the world does so. Like almost everyone who's raising kids is doing it on a much lower budget than we are. So I realize we're kind of past our halfway mark, but so we ended up having 2 children. We feel really good about that decision. We're actually expecting a 3rd child in June. So I think some of the things that we've kind of prioritized in terms of our like happiness are like living near Jeff's family. So we stayed in the Boston area, which is, one of the more expensive areas that we could be in. But it's a good place for computer work, and it's a good, it's close to Jeff's family. So we've really enjoyed being close to his sisters and their children and so forth. And having kids, I think, is something that we just feel is worth investing time and money into. And some of that is kind of, it's a lot of work now, but it's something that we feel like is likely to pay off in terms of kind of in future decades, that we'll enjoy having more people in our family and like more chance of grandchildren. And we read the Brian Kaplan book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, which a lot of EAs seem to read. And he kind of argues that like you might not want a lot of you know, children to raise right now is a lot of work in the short term. But like, if you want to have, you know, a lot of people want grandchildren, and if you want that to be you in 40 years, then you have to put in the work now. So we kind of agree with that.
I wouldn't say like the primary motivation of us having kids is so we can have grandkids.
No.
Like mostly the motivation is that we like our kids, and also as the kids get older, we can interact more with them.
And at age, like, you know, they're 5 and 6 right now, and so like even now they're, you know, just way easier and can, you know, more independent.
They're solidly people you can have quite complicated
conversations with them. Yeah, so it's like very different than having like another infant. There are good things about infants too, but like the work to reward ratio is pretty different, I would say.
So you haven't said anything about your work at CEA.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So so where I last left off, I had this kind of crisis about like, am I a terrible EA for like being a social worker? And then I just like couldn't fix that problem or didn't figure out how to fix it. So continued with social work. I got a job in a jail in South Boston. Basically, I was a therapist for prisoners. That was pretty intense. Did that for 3 years. Learned a lot. And in 2015, CEA, which was like pretty new at the time, like they literally texted me. They were like, we're trying to hire someone to work on community stuff. And like, you write this blog. And like, we had been running the Boston group. Basically, like a friend of ours had like come to Boston for grad school, and or like this guy we knew from the internet, like from back in the days where like you only met other EAs like on the internet. And but he was coming to Boston. We're like, come to our apartment, have dinner. And if you know any other people who are like interested in this kind of thing, bring them too. And he brought like 8 people, and we didn't like own that many chairs. So we're just like, wow, this is like more people than we like dreamed of knowing in one city that were interested in this. So from there, we, you know, kept hosting a regular dinner, and
acquired more chairs.
More chairs. We have a lot of folding chairs now, but some people like have to stand up sometimes, and so it might be like 30 people in our, you know, in our apartment now, and so the skills as a cook come in handy. So I cook a bunch of food, and we have discussions and dinner, and so that's kind of been the core of the Boston group for the last like decade, basically.
But you got a text about
CEA. So we've been doing this. I've been writing the blog. Like people knew that I kind of knew who I was in the community, and CEA wanted someone to do community work. And like there I was at the intersection of kind of these two areas, and it was a really great fit for me, I thought. So I took the job. You know, it was like in this early days as a startup that was kind of like didn't know what it was doing at the time. So it was like not the easiest place to work, but it's matured a lot in the last 5 years. So I'm still there as a community liaison doing different things to try and support the EA community. I think that's been like, I'm so glad that I didn't try to go into med school or something and earn to give and like try to kind of cram myself into this career that wasn't a good fit, because I ended up being able to do something that I think was a much better fit. And that's one of those things that at the time like stands out to me as like, oh man, how could EA like not have noticed that I shouldn't be earning to give, I should be doing community stuff. But we didn't. And so I think that's...
Well, I don't know. I feel like I tried to argue that you should be doing that, like...
Okay,
3 years before you ended up doing that.
Okay.
I'll link you to the blog post.
Okay. So everything is documented in the blog posts. Those might be the like key things to cover.